The single gunshot that shattered the quiet of Silveridge echoed through the dusty Main Street, causing Levi Hawkins to raise his head ever so slightly beneath the wide brim of his worn leather hat. A man lay dead outside the saloon, another senseless killing in a town where life held little value. Levi didn't even bother to watch as the shooter mounted his horse and galloped away. Such was life in the Arizona Territory in 1878, brutal, unforgiving, and exactly how he preferred it. Uncomplicated. Dust swirled around his boots as he continued his path toward the general store. At 32, Levi had already lived several lifetimes' worth of hardship. The war had taken his youth, the trail drives his innocence, and a Comanche arrow had nearly taken his life. What remained was a hardened shell of a man with piercing blue eyes that rarely met those of others, especially women. "Hawkins, you got those cattle ready for the drive to Tucson?" Sheriff Mills called from his office porch, interrupting Levi's thoughts. "2 days," Levi answered without breaking stride. "Need supplies." That was all he said, all he needed to say. In Silveridge, Levi Hawkins was known for 3 things: his unmatched skill with cattle, his deadly accuracy with a Colt .45, and his complete disinterest in female companionship. Not that Plenty hadn't tried. Every widow and unmarried woman in 3 counties had attempted to catch his eye at some point. Some out of genuine interest, others simply because he owned one of the most successful ranches in the territory. None had succeeded in getting more than a polite tip of his hat. The bell above Mr. Peterson's store jingled as Levi pushed through the door. The familiar smell of leather, tobacco, and coffee beans greeted him. He handed his supply list to Peterson without ceremony and waited at the counter while the storekeeper gathered his items. "Train came in yesterday," Peterson chattered as he worked. "Brought in some new folks. Doctor and his family moved into the old Thompson place. Shame about that consumption taking Thompson and his wife like that." Levi merely nodded. The comings and goings of townsfolk meant little to him. His ranch, the Diamond H, sat 10 miles outside town, far enough to keep the world at a comfortable distance. The door chimed again and Peterson's face lit up. "Ah, Miss O'Brien, perfect timing. Your order arrived on yesterday's train." Levi didn't turn around. Another new arrival meant nothing to him. "Thank you, Mr. Peterson. I was beginning to worry my books would never make it." The voice was clear and confident, with a slight Eastern accent that immediately marked her as an outsider. Something in that voice, a warmth, perhaps made Levi's shoulders tense. He stared harder at the counter, unwilling to acknowledge the strange sensation creeping up his spine. "Mr. Hawkins here is stocking up for a cattle drive," Peterson continued, seemingly determined to make introductions. "Levi, this is Miss Zara O'Brien. She's taken over the schoolhouse." Social convention demanded he at least acknowledge her presence. With reluctance, Levi turned. Time slowed. The world narrowed to a single point as his eyes met hers. Green, not the pale green of spring grass, but the deep, verdant green of the forest after rainfall. Those eyes stared back at him with intelligence and something he couldn't quite identify. Challenge, perhaps. "Mr. Hawkins," she said with a slight nod, her auburn hair catching the sunlight streaming through the window. For the first time in years, Levi Hawkins found himself without words. He managed a nod, his throat suddenly dry. "Your supplies, Levi," Peterson prompted after an awkward silence. Levi broke the gaze, turning back to the counter with unexpected difficulty. "Put it on my account," he muttered, gathering his supplies with hands that felt strangely unsteady. He tipped his hat out of habit as he passed her, catching another glimpse of those extraordinary eyes. Something unfamiliar stirred within him, something he'd thought long dead. Outside, He loaded his supplies into his wagon with mechanical movements, his mind elsewhere. The sound of the store door opening again made him glance up involuntarily. She emerged, carrying a crate of books, struggling slightly with the weight. Before he could question his actions, Levi found himself moving toward her. "Allow me," he said, taking the crate from her surprised hands. "Thank you, Mr. Hawkins," she replied, that Eastern accent making his name sound different somehow. "My wagon is just there." He followed her to a small buggy and placed the books carefully in the back. Up close, he noticed details he'd missed inside. She was tall for a woman, the top of her head reaching his chin. Her dress was practical but well-made, her posture straight as a cavalry officer's. "You're the new schoolteacher," he said, stating the obvious just to have something to say. "I am." She smiled slightly. "I arrived last week from Boston, about as far from Arizona territory as one could get." "Why here?" The question seemed to catch her off guard. Then she smiled, a real smile that transformed her face entirely. "Because I was needed here. The children deserve education, even in the frontier." Levi nodded, finding himself strangely curious about this woman who would leave civilization for a dusty, dangerous frontier town. "The schoolhouse hasn't been used in 2 years. I'm aware. I've been cleaning it this past week." She held out her hand. "Thank you for your help, Mr. Hawkins." Her palm was soft but not delicate, the hand of someone who wasn't afraid of work. Levi released it quickly, uncomfortable with the contact and even more uncomfortable with his reaction to it. "Madam," he said with a tip of his hat, retreating to his wagon. As he drove out of town, Levi found himself looking back once, something he never did. The schoolteacher was still standing by her buggy, watching him go. He snapped the reins, urging his horses faster, as if he could outrun the strange feeling that had settled in his chest. At the Diamond H, work provided the distraction he needed. 2,000 head of cattle needed to be ready for the drive to Tucson, and his men were waiting for instructions. Jake Cooper, his foreman for 5 years, noticed something was off immediately. "You look like you've seen a ghost, boss," Jake commented as they checked the herd. "New schoolteacher in town," Levi said shortly. Jake's eyebrows shot up. "That's what's got you rattled? A schoolmarm?" "I'm not rattled." Levi's tone ended the conversation. That night, sleep eluded him. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw green ones staring back. It was ridiculous. He'd exchanged perhaps 10 words with the woman. There was no reason she should occupy his thoughts. The next morning, he sent Jake into town for the remaining supplies they needed, unwilling to risk another encounter himself. For 2 days, he worked from sunrise until well after sunset, driving himself and his men hard in preparation for the drive. On the morning they were set to leave, Sheriff Mills rode out to the ranch. "Trouble in town?" Levi asked, immediately alert. Mills shook his head. "Nothing like that. Got a message for you. Stage brought mail yesterday. This came for you from the territorial governor's office." Levi took the envelope, breaking the seal with his thumb. As he read, his expression darkened. "Bad news?" Mills asked. "Governor wants me to postpone the drive. Army contract's been delayed. Says to hold the herd for 2 more weeks." Mills whistled. "That's a lot of cattle to keep corralled." "And a lot of men with nothing to do," Levi added, already calculating the problems this would cause. Bored cowboys inevitably meant trouble. After Mills left, Levi gathered his men to break the news. As expected, many were disappointed, having anticipated both the work and the celebration that would follow in Tucson. "Take 3 days in town if you want," he told them, "but I expect everyone back and ready to work by Monday." The offer was met with enthusiasm, and within an hour most of his hands were riding toward Silveridge. Jake lingered behind. "You coming to town, boss?" Levi shook his head. "Someone needs to watch the ranch." Jake gave him a knowing look. "This wouldn't have anything to do with that schoolteacher you mentioned, would it?" "Don't you have somewhere to be, Cooper?" Levi replied gruffly. Jake laughed and mounted his horse. "Don't work yourself to death while we're gone." Alone at the ranch, Levi tried to focus on the endless tasks that needed attention. By the second day, however, he found himself restless in a way he hadn't been in years. Convincing himself he needed to check on his men, make sure they weren't causing too much trouble in town, he saddled his horse and rode toward Silveridge. The town was livelier than usual with his cowboys, adding to the normal Saturday bustle. He stabled his horse and walked down the main street, nodding to those who greeted him but maintaining his usual reserve. Without conscious intent, he found himself walking past the schoolhouse. It sat at the edge of town, a simple wooden structure that had fallen into disrepair after the last teacher left. Now, though, the windows were clean, the steps swept. Through the open door he could hear a voice reading aloud. Curiosity got the better of him. He approached quietly, stopping just outside where he could see in without being immediately noticed. Zara O'Brien sat on a chair, surrounded by perhaps a dozen children of various ages seated on benches. Several mothers sat at the back of the room. She was reading from a book, her expressive voice bringing the story to life. "All children except one grow up," she read. "They soon know that they will grow up, and the way Wendy knew was this." The children were entranced, and Levi found himself equally captivated, not by the story but by the storyteller. Her face was animated, her hands occasionally gesturing to emphasize a point. This was clearly not just a job to her but a calling. As if sensing his presence, she glanced up suddenly, her eyes finding his. She faltered for just a moment before continuing, but Levi saw the slight color that rose to her cheeks. Embarrassed to be caught eavesdropping, he stepped back and was about to leave when one of the women from the back approached him. "Mr. Hawkins, what a surprise," Mrs. Nelson said. "Have you come for the reading hour?" "Just passing by," he replied awkwardly. "Miss O'Brien started this Saturday program for the children," she explained. "Even before formal classes begin next month. Isn't she wonderful?" Inside, the story had concluded, and children were gathering around a table where cookies and lemonade had been set out. Zara was speaking with some of the mothers, but her eyes kept drifting to the doorway where he stood. "Excuse me," he said to Mrs. Nelson, intending to make his escape. Before he could leave, however, Zara approached, a tentative smile on her face. "Mr. Hawkins, I didn't expect to see you in town today. Checking on my men," he explained stiffly. "Cattle drive was postponed." "I see," she hesitated. "Would you care for some lemonade? Mrs. Abernathy makes it fresh." The invitation surprised him, as did his response. "Thank you." She led him to a side table where a pitcher and glasses had been set up, away from the excited chatter of children. As she poured him a glass, he noticed a small scar on the inside of her wrist. "You're making progress with the schoolhouse," he commented, accepting the drink. "Yes, though there's still much to do." She glanced around. "The roof leaks in 3 places and the winter will be cold without proper sealing around the windows." "I could take a look," he offered before he could stop himself. "At the roof?" Her eyes widened slightly. "That's very kind of you, Mr. Hawkins." "Levi," he said impulsively. "Mr. Hawkins was my father." "Levi," she repeated, and something about the way she said it made his name sound new. "Then you must call me Zara." A small boy interrupted them, tugging at Zara's skirt. "Miss O'Brien, Tommy took 2 cookies," she smiled down at him. "Then perhaps you should also take 2 to be fair." The boy grinned and ran back to the table. "You're good with them," Levi observed. "Children are honest," she replied. They say what they think and feel without the constraints we adults place on ourselves. Something in her tone made him wonder if she was referring to him specifically. Before he could respond, Mrs. Nelson approached again. "Miss O'Brien, we mothers were thinking of organizing a picnic next Saturday by the creek. Would you join us? Mr. Hawkins, you and your men would be welcome too." Levi was already shaking his head, his instinctive response to any social invitation when Zara spoke. "That sounds lovely, Mrs. Nelson. I would be delighted to attend." Her eyes met his, a challenge in them. "Will you come?" Levi put on the spot. With both women looking at him expectantly, he found himself nodding. "Perhaps." Mrs. Nelson beamed. "Wonderful, 1 o'clock at Willow Creek." After she walked away, Zara raised an eyebrow. "Perhaps. I have a ranch to run," he said defensively. "Of course." She didn't hide her disappointment well. "The roof inspection. Would tomorrow afternoon be convenient?" Tomorrow was Sunday. He typically used the day to catch up on accounts and planning. "I'll be here at 2. As he walked back toward the saloon where most of his men were likely gathered, Levi wondered what had possessed him. In the span of 10 minutes, he'd agreed to inspect a roof and half committed to a town picnic. Neither were activities Levi Hawkins participated in. Ever. The next day, true to his word, Levi arrived at the schoolhouse precisely at 2. He'd spent the morning distracted, alternating between wanting to send a message canceling the appointment and checking the time to ensure he wouldn't be late. Zara was already there, her hair tied back with a simple ribbon, wearing a practical skirt and shirtwaist rather than the more formal attire she'd worn in town. She was attempting to move a heavy desk when he entered, and he immediately went to assist her. "Where do you want it?" he asked, lifting the desk easily. "By the window, please." She brushed a strand of hair from her forehead. "The light is better there for reading." After positioning the desk, Levi examined the roof from inside, noting the water stains on the ceiling. "I'll need to check from above." "Do you have a ladder?" "Behind the building," she directed. For the next hour, Levi worked on the roof, replacing damaged shingles and sealing leaks. Zara remained below, organizing books and supplies. Occasionally, they exchanged words about the repairs or the upcoming school year, but mostly they worked in a surprisingly comfortable silence. When he finally descended, she offered him water from a canteen. "Thank you," she said as he drank. "I didn't expect such thorough repairs." "Job's worth doing right," he replied simply, handing back the canteen. Their fingers brushed, and he felt that same strange jolt he'd experienced in the general store. "Would you like some coffee?" she asked. "I brought some from my lodgings." The sensible thing would be to decline, to return to his ranch in the safety of solitude. Instead, he heard himself say, "That would be nice." She lit a small stove at the back of the schoolhouse and set water to boil in a pot. As they waited, she asked about his ranch. 2,000 acres, he told her. "Mostly cattle, some horses, been there 8 years now. And before that," he hesitated. People rarely asked about his past, and he rarely offered information. "War. Then cattle drives, saved enough to buy the land when the previous owner died of fever." She nodded, not pressing for details he wasn't offering. "I taught in Boston for 5 years before coming here." "Why leave?" It was the same question he'd asked before, but now he genuinely wanted to know. She was quiet for a moment, pouring the coffee into 2 tin cups before answering. "My father died last year. He was a doctor, dedicated his life to helping others. When I saw the advertisement for a teacher needed in Arizona territory, it seemed like a way to honor his memory to go where I was needed. Most women would consider it too dangerous." Her eyes met his directly. "I'm not most women, Levi." No, she certainly wasn't. Most women didn't travel alone across the country to teach in a frontier town. Most women didn't look at him the way she did, as if she could see past the walls he'd built around himself. "The picnic next Saturday," he said suddenly. "I'll be there." Her smile was like sunrise breaking over the mountains. "I'm glad." That evening, riding back to the Diamond H, Levi felt lighter somehow, as if a burden he hadn't known he was carrying had been lifted slightly. He tried to dismiss the feeling, to focus on the work ahead, but his thoughts kept returning to green eyes and a smile that seemed meant just for him. The week passed both too slowly and too quickly. Levi drove his men hard, rotating the cattle to fresh grazing areas and maintaining the endless fences that marked his property. Each night, he told himself the sensible course was to forget about the picnic, to send his regrets. Each morning, he found himself counting the days until Saturday. Friday evening, Jake Cooper found him in the barn, brushing down his stallion with unusual care. "Planning on riding somewhere special tomorrow, boss?" Jake asked with poorly concealed amusement. "Town picnic," Levi replied gruffly. Jake's eyebrows shot up. "You, at a town picnic?" "This I have to see." "You're not invited." "Oh, I'm coming anyway," Jake grinned. "Wouldn't miss it for the world. Does this sudden interest in social gatherings have anything to do with a certain green-eyed schoolteacher?" Levi pointed the brush at him threateningly. "Don't you have work to do?" Jake backed away, hands raised in mock surrender. "Just saying what everyone's thinking. You've been different this week. Not bad different, just different." After Jake left, Levi leaned against his horse's flank. Had he been that obvious? The idea that his men had noticed his preoccupation was unsettling. He'd always kept his feelings what few he allowed himself private. The fact that Zara O'Brien had managed to disrupt his carefully maintained equilibrium in just over a week was concerning. Yet when Saturday arrived, Levi found himself riding toward Willow Creek with a mixture of anticipation and nervousness he hadn't felt in years. He'd even worn a clean shirt and his least worn pair of jeans. The creek area was already bustling with activity when he arrived. Blankets were spread under the shade of willow trees, baskets of food being unpacked by women in their Sunday best. Children ran about, their laughter mixing with the gentle sound of flowing water. Levi spotted her immediately. Zara stood with Mrs. Nelson and several other women, wearing a blue dress that brought out the auburn highlights in her hair. As if sensing his presence, she looked up, their eyes meeting across the distance. She smiled and raised a hand in greeting. He dismounted and secured his horse, feeling suddenly out of place. These were the same townsfolk he'd lived alongside for years, yet he'd never joined them like this. He was the solitary rancher, the man who came to town only for supplies or business. Before he could reconsider his decision, Zara was walking toward him. "You came," she said, genuine pleasure in her voice. "Said I would," he replied, removing his hat. "Yes, you did." She gestured toward the gathering. "Mrs. Abernathy has prepared enough food to feed an army. Will you join us?" He followed her to where the others were setting up, aware of the curious glances directed his way. Sheriff Mills raised an eyebrow but said nothing as Levi settled onto a blanket beside Zara. The afternoon passed in a blur of conversation, food, and unexpected enjoyment. Levi found himself drawn into discussions about cattle prices with Mr. Peterson, the drought conditions with other ranchers, and even played a game of horseshoes with some of the men. Throughout it all, he remained conscious of Zara's presence nearby. She moved among the townsfolk with easy grace, clearly already accepted as one of their own despite her short time in Silveridge. As the afternoon waned, he found himself walking alongside her at the edge of the creek, away from the main gathering. "Enjoying yourself?" she asked, bending to pick up a smooth stone. "More than I expected," he admitted. She skipped the stone across the water, achieving 4 bounces before it sank. "You don't socialize much." It wasn't a question, but he answered anyway. "Never saw the need." Human connection is a need, Levi. As essential as food or water, he considered this. Been managing without it for some time. Have you? She looked at him directly. Or have you just convinced yourself you have? The question struck closer to home than he was comfortable with. Before he could formulate a response, a shout from upstream broke the moment. A child's scream followed by panicked calls from adults. "Tommy's in the water. He can't swim." Without hesitation, Levi ran toward the commotion, Zara close behind him. At a bend in the creek, the water deepened into a pool. A small boy, the same one who had complained about cookies at the schoolhouse, was struggling in the center, his head barely above water. Levi didn't think. He kicked off his boots and dove in, powerful strokes carrying him to the frightened child. The boy clutched at him desperately, nearly dragging them both under before Levi secured him with one arm and swam back toward shore with the other. Hands reached to pull the boy to safety as Levi hauled himself out of the water. The child's mother enveloped him in a tearful embrace, while others patted Levi on the back with grateful words. Zara appeared with a blanket, draping it around his shoulders. "That was brave," she said softly. Water streamed from his clothes, his hat lost somewhere in the creek. He felt exposed, not just physically, but emotionally. The intensity of fear he'd felt when he saw the child struggling had surprised him, a reminder that despite his best efforts, he wasn't as detached from humanity as he pretended. "Anyone would have done the same," he muttered. "But you did it," she insisted, without hesitation. The commotion had effectively ended the picnic. Families gathered their belongings, the mood subdued by the near tragedy. Levi found his horse and prepared to leave, still wet and chilled despite the warm afternoon. "You should get into dry clothes," Zara said, approaching as he mounted. "My lodgings are closer than your ranch." The propriety of such a suggestion should have given him pause, but all he could think about was the concern in her eyes. "I'll be fine." "Levi Hawkins, you are the most stubborn man I've ever met," she said with surprising firmness. "You just saved a child's life and you're shivering. My landlady will be home, if that's what concerns you." It wasn't, not really. What concerned him was the growing realization that this woman was becoming important to him, dangerously so. Nevertheless, he found himself following her buggy back to town, to a small but neat house on a side street where she rented rooms from the widow Thompson. Mrs. Thompson fussed over him like a mother hen, providing a set of her late husband's clothes that were only slightly too small, and insisting he sit by the fire in the parlor while she prepared hot coffee. When Zara joined him, her expression was serious. "Tommy will be fine, just frightened." "Good," he said, staring into the flames. They sat in silence for a time, the only sounds the crackling of the fire and Mrs. Thompson's movements in the kitchen. Finally, Zara spoke. "Why do you live so alone, Levi?" He could have deflected, changed the subject, but something about nearly watching a child drown had stripped away his usual defenses. "It's simpler, safer." "Safer for whom?" "Everyone." He looked at her then. "I watched men die in the war, friends. After that it seemed easier not to care too much." She moved closer, her hand coming to rest tentatively on his arm. "But you do care, I've seen it. With your men, with the townsfolk today, with that little boy." "Caring hurts," he said simply. "Yes," she agreed softly, "it does, but not caring hurts more in the end." Her eyes held his, and in that moment, Levi felt something shift within him, a wall beginning to crumble. Before he could examine the feeling, Mrs. Thompson bustled in with coffee and biscuits, breaking the moment. The rest of the evening passed in quiet conversation. Levi found himself telling Zara about his ranch, his plans for expansion, even sharing stories of his childhood in Missouri before the war. In return, she spoke of Boston, of her father's medical practice where she had helped as a girl, of her dreams for the school in Sylvie Ridge. By the time his clothes had dried and he prepared to leave, night had fallen. Mrs. Thompson had retired, leaving them alone in the parlor. "Thank you," he said, struggling to find the right words. "For the hospitality," she smiled. "Will I see you in town again soon?" "I expect so." He hesitated. "The school term starts next week." "Monday," she confirmed. "Perhaps you'd allow me to escort you to dinner on Friday evening, to celebrate your first week of teaching." The invitation surprised them both. Levi had never asked a woman to dinner, not in all his years in Sylvie Ridge. "I would like that very much," she replied, her smile soft in the lamplight. Outside, as he mounted his horse, she called after him, "Levi, I'm glad you came to the picnic today." He tipped his hat. "So am I." The ride back to the Diamond H seemed shorter than usual, his mind occupied with green eyes and gentle smiles. For the first time in years, Levi Hawkins found himself looking forward to something other than work. The days that followed fell into a pattern. Levi would find reasons to visit town supplies needed, business with the bank, checking on his men. Each visit somehow included an encounter with Zara. Sometimes just a brief exchange on the street, other times longer conversations at the schoolhouse where he continued to help with repairs. Friday arrived and Levi dressed with unusual care. He chose his best shirt, the one he typically reserved for trips to Tucson, and even attempted to tame his unruly dark hair. Jake watched these preparations with barely concealed amusement. "Planning to propose tonight, boss?" Levi glared at him. "Mind your own business, Cooper. Just saying, in all the years I've known you, I've never seen you shine your boots for a woman before." Levi threw a brush at him, which Jake dodged easily. Laughing as he left the cabin in town, Levi collected Zara from her lodgings, conscious of Mrs. Thompson's approving gaze as they left. He'd arranged for them to dine at the hotel restaurant, the closest thing Sylvie Ridge had to fine dining. Zara wore a dress he hadn't seen before, a deep green that matched her eyes. Her hair was arranged more elaborately than usual, soft curls framing her face. "You look." He searched for a word adequate to express what he felt. "Beautiful." The slight color that rose to her cheeks was captivating. "Thank you. You look quite handsome yourself." Dinner was a revelation. Levi found himself talking more than he had in years, drawn out by Zara's genuine interest and thoughtful questions. She told him about her first week of teaching, the challenges and rewards, her plans for the children's education. "You really care about them," he observed. "I do. Every child deserves a chance to learn, to grow beyond their circumstances." She paused. "Even here, especially here, education can change lives." "You've already changed things in Sylvie Ridge," he said. "The town seems livelier since you arrived. Is that a good thing?" She asked, a teasing light in her eyes. "I'm beginning to think so." After dinner, they walked through the quiet streets. The night was clear, stars brilliant overhead in a way they never seemed to be back east, she remarked. "I never tire of this sky," Levi admitted, "even after all these years." They stopped at the edge of town, where the buildings gave way to open country. In the distance, the silhouette of mountains was visible against the starlit horizon. "I understand now," Zara said softly. "Understand what? Why you came here. Why you stayed. There's a freedom here that doesn't exist elsewhere." He turned to face her. "Is that why you came? For freedom?" She considered this. "Partly, but also for purpose, to make a difference. You have," he said, "not just to the town." Their eyes met, and Levi felt that now familiar tightening in his chest. Without conscious thought, he leaned closer. She didn't pull away. Their first kiss was gentle, tentative a question being asked and answered. When they parted, her eyes remained closed for a moment, as if holding onto the sensation. "I should take you home," he said, his voice rougher than usual. She nodded, but neither moved immediately. Finally, he offered his arm, and she placed her hand in the crook of his elbow. At her door, they kissed again, longer this time with growing confidence. When they separated, she touched his face lightly. "Good night, Levi." "Good night, Zara." Riding back to his ranch, Levi felt both elated and terrified. Something was happening that he couldn't control, couldn't predict. For a man who had spent years maintaining rigid order in his life, the sensation was unsettling. Yet he couldn't bring himself to regret it. The weeks that followed were unlike any Levi had ever experienced. He found himself in town almost daily, helping with school repairs, bringing books from his own modest library that he thought might interest the students, or simply finding moments to see Zara. The town noticed, of course. Gossip spread rapidly in a place like Silveridge. To Levi's surprise, the reactions were largely positive. The townsfolk seemed pleased to see their reclusive rancher finally showing interest in something besides cattle. The delayed cattle drive to Tucson came and went, Levi returning to find Zara waiting for him at the edge of town, a sight that made the long journey worthwhile. They settled into a routine of Friday dinners and Sunday afternoon rides. As autumn approached, bringing cooler temperatures to the high desert, Levi realized he was facing a decision. The feelings he had for Zara weren't diminishing, quite the opposite. Each day apart from her seemed longer than the last, each reunion sweeter. On a crisp October evening, he invited her to the Diamond H for the first time. He'd spent days preparing, cleaning the ranch house that had always been functional but never particularly welcoming. Jake and the other hands made themselves scarce as Levi gave Zara a tour of the property. She admired the well-built corrals, the sturdy barn, the carefully maintained pastures. But it was the view from the hillside behind the house that truly captivated her. "It's breathtaking," she said, gazing across the valley where the setting sun painted the landscape in gold and crimson. "It's why I built here," Levi explained. "First time I saw this view, I knew this was where I wanted to stay." They stood together, watching the sun sink below the horizon. When darkness fell, he led her back to the house where he'd prepared dinner, a simple meal but cooked with more care than he'd ever taken before. After they ate, sitting before the fireplace, Levi found himself unusually nervous. He'd faced Comanche raiders with less trepidation than he felt now. "I have something to ask you," he began. She turned to him, the firelight casting a warm glow on her face. "Yes, these past months have been, I've never—" He stopped, frustrated by his inability to express what he felt. Zara reached for his hand. "Tell me." He took a deep breath. "Before you came to Silveridge, I thought I knew what my life would be. Work, solitude, more work. I convinced myself that was enough." He met her eyes. "It wasn't. I just didn't know what I was missing." "And now," she asked softly, "now I know." He reached into his pocket, withdrawing a small box. "Zara O'Brien, will you marry me?" Her eyes widened as he opened the box to reveal a ring, a simple gold band with a small emerald that matched her eyes. "I love you," he continued, the words coming easier now. "I want to build a life with you if you'll have me." Tears filled her eyes, but she was smiling. "Yes," she whispered. "Yes, Levi Hawkins, I will marry you." He slipped the ring onto her finger, then pulled her into his arms, his kiss conveying everything words couldn't. They were married in November, in Silveridge's small church. The entire town attended along with Levi's ranch hands. Sheriff Mills stood as his best man, Mrs. Thompson as Zara's matron of honor. As winter settled over the territory, the Diamond H Ranch house was transformed. Curtains appeared at windows, books filled shelves, and laughter echoed in rooms that had known only silence before. Zara continued teaching, riding to town each morning and returning each afternoon. Levi expanded the ranch's operations, breeding horses alongside his cattle business. Together, they established a scholarship fund for Silveridge students who wished to continue their education beyond what the local school could provide. Spring brought new life to the land and news that their family would grow by one come fall. Levi, who had once believed himself incapable of such happiness, found himself overwhelmed with gratitude, standing on the hillside behind their home, his arms wrapped around his wife as they watched the sunset. Levi reflected on the journey that had brought them here. "What are you thinking about?" Zara asked, leaning back against him. "How different life can be when you allow yourself to truly see someone," he answered, his hand resting protectively over her growing belly. "And be seen in return." She turned in his arms, her eyes those extraordinary green eyes that had first captured him meeting his. "I saw you that very first day in the general store, Levi Hawkins. The real you, not the man you pretended to be. I'm glad you did," he said softly. "I'm glad you had the courage to see past my walls." "And I'm glad you had the courage to let them fall," she replied, reaching up to touch his face. "Love requires courage, perhaps more than anything else we do." As the last light faded from the sky, they walked hand in hand back to the house that had become a home, to the life they were building together, a life richer and more fulfilling than either had imagined possible. The cowboy, who never looked twice at any woman, had found the one worth looking at for a lifetime.